Chapter 3, Gwen. On opening day, I walked to my new school alone. It was the first and last time that such a thing would happen. All around me were other people in my age, 12 years, girls and boys dressed in their school uniforms marching off to school. They all seemed to know each other, and as they met, they would burst into laughter, slapping each other on the shoulder and back, telling each other things that have made for much happiness. I saw some girls wearing the same uniform as my own, and my heart just longed for them to say something to me, but the most they could do to include me was to smile and nod in my direction as they walked on arm in arm. I could hardly blame them for not paying more attention to me. Everything about me was so new. My uniform was new, my shoes were new, my hat was new, my shoulder ached from the weight of my new books in my new bag. Even the road I walked on was new. And I must have put my feet down as if I weren't sure the ground was solid. At school, the yard was filled with more of these girls and their most sure of themselves gaits. When I looked at them, they made up a sea. They were walking in and out among the beds of flowers all across the fields, all across the courtyard, in and out of classrooms, except for me. No one seemed a stranger to anything or anyone. Hearing the way they greeted each other, I couldn't be sure that they hadn't all come out of the same woman's belly. And at the same time, too, looking at them, I was suddenly glad that because I had wanted to avoid an argument with my mother, I had eaten all my breakfast, for now I surely would have fainted if I had been in any more weakened a condition. I knew where my classroom was because my mother and I had kept an appointment at the school a week before. There I met some of my teachers and was shown the ins and outs of everything. When I saw it then, it was nice and orderly and empty and smelled just scrubbed. Now it smelled of girls milling around, fresh ink in inkwells, new books, chalk and erasers. The girls in my classroom acted even more familiar with each other. I was sure I would never be able to tell them apart just from looking at them, and I was sure that I would never be able to tell them apart from the sound of their voices. When the school bell rang at 8:30, we formed ourselves into the required pairs and filed into the auditorium for morning prayers and hymn singing. Our headmistress gave us a little talk, welcoming the new students and welcoming back the old students, and saying that she hoped we had all left our bad ways behind us, that we would be good examples for each other and bring greater credit to our school than any of the other groups of girls who had been there before us. My palms were wet, and quite a few times the ground felt as if it were seesawing under my feet, but that didn't stop me from taking in a few things. For instance, the headmistress, Miss Moore, I knew right away that she had come to Antigua from England, for she looked like a prune left out of its jar a long time, and she sounded as if she had borrowed her voice from an owl. The way she said, "Now, girls," when she was just standing still there listening to some of the other activities, her gray eyes going all around the room, hoping to see something wrong. Her throat would beat up and down, as if a fish fresh out of water were caught inside. I wondered if she even smelled like a fish. Once, when I didn't wash, my mother had given me a long scolding about it, and she ended by saying that it was the only thing she didn't like about English people. They didn't wash often enough, or wash properly when they finally did. My mother had said, "Have you ever noticed how they smell as if they had been bottled up in a fish?" On either side of Miss Moore stood our other teachers, women and men, mostly women. I recognized Miss George, our music teacher, Miss Nelson, our homeroom teacher, Miss Edward, our history and geography teacher, and Miss Newgate, our algebra and geometry teacher. I had met them the day my mother and I were at school. I did not know who the others were, and I did not worry about it, since they were teachers. I was sure it wouldn't be long before because of some misunderstanding, they would be thorns in my side. We walked back to our classroom the same way we had come, quite orderly and, except for a few whispered exchanges, quite silent. But no sooner were we back in our classroom than the girls were in each other's laps, arms wrapped around necks. After peeping over my shoulder left and right, I sat down in my seat and wondered what would become of me. There were 20 of us in my class, and we were seated at desks arranged 5 in a row, 4 rows deep. I was at a desk in the 3rd row, and this made me even more miserable. I hated to be seated so far away from the teacher because I was sure I would miss something she said. But even worse, if I was out of my teacher's sight all the time. How could she see my industriousness and quickness at learning things? And besides, only dunces were seated so far to the rear, and I could not bear to be thought of a dunce. I was now staring at the back of a shrubby-haired girl seated in the front row, the seat I most coveted, since it was directly in front of the teacher's desk. At that moment, the girl twisted herself around, stared at me, and said, "You're Annie John. We hear you're very bright." It was a good thing Miss Nelson walked in right then, for how would it have appeared if I had replied, "Yes, that's completely true," the very thing that was on the tip of my tongue. As soon as Miss Nelson walked in, we came to order and stood up stiffly at our desks. She said to us, "Good morning, class," half in a way that someone must have told her was the proper way to speak to us, and half in a jocular way, as if we secretly amused her. We replied, "Good morning, miss," in unison and in a respectful way, at the same time making a barely visible curtsy, also in unison. When she had seated herself at her desk, she said to us, "You may sit now," and we did. She opened the roll book, and as she called out our names, each of us answered, "Present, miss." As she called out our names, she kept her head bent over the book, but when she called out my name and I answered with the customary response, she looked up and smiled at me and said, "Welcome, Annie." Everyone, of course, then turned around and looked at me. I was sure it was because they could hear the loud racket my heart was making in my chest. It was the first day of a new term, Miss Nelson said, so we would not be attending to any of our usual subjects. Instead, we were to spend the morning in contemplation and reflection and writing something she described as an autobiographical essay. In the afternoon, we would read aloud to each other our autobiographical essays. I knew quite well about autobiography and essay, but reflection and contemplation? A day at school spent in such a way? Of course, in most books, all the good people were always contemplating and reflecting before they did anything. Perhaps in her mind's eye, she could see our futures, and against all prediction, we turned out to be good people. On hearing this, a huge sigh went up from the girls. Half the sighs were in happiness at the thought of sitting and gazing off into clear space, the other half in unhappiness, as the misdeeds that would have to go unaccomplished. I joined the happy half because I knew it would please Miss Nelson, and my own selfish interest aside. I liked so much the way she wore her ironed hair and her long-sleeved blouse and box-pleated skirt that I wanted to please her. The morning was uneventful enough. A girl spilled ink from her inkwell all over her uniform. A girl broke her pen nib and then made a big to-do about replacing it. Girls twisted and turned in their seats and pinched each other's bottoms. Girls passed notes to each other. All this Miss Nelson must have seen and heard, but she didn't say anything, only kept reading her book, an elaborately illustrated edition of The Tempest, as later, passing by her desk, I saw. Midway in the morning, we were told to go out and stretch our legs and breathe some fresh air for a few minutes. When we returned, we were given glasses of cold lemonade and a slice of bun to refresh us. As soon as the sun stood in the middle of the sky, we were sent home for lunch. The earth may have grown an inch or two larger between the time I had walked to school that morning and the time I went home to lunch, for some girls made a small space for me in their little band, but I couldn't pay much attention to them. My mind was on my new surroundings, my new teacher. What I had written in my nice new notebook with its black, all mixed up with white cover and smooth-lined pages. So glad was I to get rid of my old notebooks, which had on their covers a picture of a wrinkled-up woman wearing a crown on her head and a neckful of armful of diamonds and pearls, their pages so coarse as if they were made of cornmeal. I flew home. I must have eaten my food. I flew back to school. By 1:30, we were sitting under a flamboyant tree in a secluded part of our schoolyard, our autobiographical essays in hand. We were about to read aloud what we had written during our morning of contemplation and reflection. In response to Miss Nelson, each girl stood up and read her composition. One girl told of a much revered and loved aunt who now lived in England, and of how much she looked forward to one day moving to England to live with her aunt. One girl told of her brother studying medicine in Canada, and the life she imagined he lived there. It seemed quite odd to me. One girl told of the fright she had when she dreamed she was dead, and of the matching fright she had when she woke and found that she wasn't. Everyone laughed at this, and Miss Nelson had to call us to order over and over. One girl told of how her older sister's best friend's cousin's best friend. It was a real rigmarole. I had gone on a Girl Guide jamboree held in Trinidad and met someone who, millions of years ago, had taken tea with Lady Baden-Powell. One girl told of an excursion she and her father had made to Redonda and how they had seen some booby birds tending their chicks. Things went on in that way. Also playful, also imaginative. I began to wonder about what I had written, for it was the opposite of playful and it was the opposite of imaginative. What I had written was heartfelt, and except for the very end, it was all true. The afternoon was wearing itself thin. Would my turn ever come? What should I do, finding myself in a world of new girls, a world in which I was not even near the center? It was a while before I realized that Miss Nelson was calling on me. My turn at last to read what I had written. I got up and started to read, my voice shaky at first, but since the sound of my voice had always been a calming potion to me, it wasn't long before I was reading in such a way that except for the chirp of some birds, the hum of bees looking for flowers, the silvery rush of the wind in the trees, the only sound to be heard was my voice, as it rose and fell in sentence after sentence. At the end of my reading, I thought I was imagining the upturned faces on which were looks of adoration, but I was not. I thought I was imagining, too, some eyes brimming over with tears, but again, I was not. Miss Nelson said that she would like to borrow what I had written to read for herself, and that it would be placed on the shelf with the books that made up our class library, so that it would be available to any girl who wanted to read it. This is what I had written. When I was a small child, my mother and I used to go down to Rat Island on Sundays, right after church, so that I could bathe in the sea. It was at that time when I thought to have weak kidneys, and a bath in the sea had been recommended as a strengthening remedy. Rat Island wasn't a place many people went to anyway, but by climbing down some rocks, my mother had found a place that nobody seemed to have ever been. Since this bathing in the sea was a medicine and not a picnic, we had to bathe without wearing swimming costumes. My mother was a superior swimmer. When she plunged into the seawater, it was as if she had always lived there. She would go far out if it was safe to do so, and she could tell just by looking at the way the waves beat if it was safe to do so. She could tell if a shark was nearby, and she had never been stung by a jellyfish. I, on the other hand, could not swim at all. In fact, if I was in water up to my knees, I was sure that I was drowning. My mother had tried everything to get me swimming, from using a coaxing method to just throwing me without a word into the water. Nothing worked. The only way I could go into the water was if I was on my mother's back. My arms clasped tightly around her neck, and she would then swim around not too far from the shore. It was only then that I could forget how big the sea was, how far down the bottom could be, and how filled up it was with things that couldn't understand a nice hollow. When we swam around in this way, I would think how much we were like the pictures of sea mammals I had seen. My mother and I, naked in the seawater, my mother sometimes singing to me a song in French patois I did not yet understand, or sometimes not saying anything at all. I would place my ear against her neck, and it was as if I were listening to a giant shell, for all the sounds around me, the sea, the wind, the birds screeching, would seem as if they came from inside her, the way the sounds of the sea are in a seashell. Afterward, my mother would take me back to the shore, and I would lie there just beyond the farthest reach of a big wave and watch my mother as she swam and dove. One day, in the midst of watching my mother swim and dive, I heard a commotion.